Back to A Neighbor's Choice Radio. Happy to have this time with you. I wanted to look at this story on Zero Hedge, but before I do that, I want to bring on my guest now, who's the host of the Rooster's Crow podcast, James Cortides. How you doing, sir?
I am well, David. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Doing great. I saw this Zero Hedge story. It says, those who master artificial intelligence and synthetic biology will be master of the world. That's what Klaus Schwab said he's the chairman of the World Economic Forum during an event in Dubai. He says that technologies like AI and metaverse, cryptocurrencies, space tech, and synthetic biology will change the world. Our life in 10 years from now will be completely different, very much affected, and who masters those technologies in some way will be the master of the world. And what's interesting about this is that this reflects something that I've been saying a lot on this show, which is that these folks who talk these big games about technology, it's always stuff, mostly aside from, I guess, a little bit the space tech stuff, but it's mostly in the world of bits. It's in the world of the mind. It's in the world of the virtual, metaverse, AI, crypto, synthetic biologies, using computers to create fake limbs or, maybe fake food. All this stuff it's not dealing with the actual material world, like having flying cars and energy too cheap to meter and having elemental transmutation so that we don't have to have rare earth elements mined, but we can pull them out of other elements at room temperature using magnetic fields, anti-gravity, being able to have, machines and technology that doesn't need propulsion technology to move, or, something more closer to Earth, like an absolute cure for cancer using dietary changes. Those are all the things we talk about on this show in terms of technology. It's all physical, incarnational truth, which I think is a reflection of a Christian worldview, which looks at actually incarnational physical solutions to meet people's needs and lack, rather than these things, metaverse. There's no real pain and suffering that metaverse is actually going to meet. AI, that's kind of ancillary in my opinion. Crypto, again, if we had real honest money, we wouldn't need to be worrying about getting into crypto, but it's just a reaction to fiat, and then, I guess there is some value in synthetic biology to some degree for some, maybe prosthetic limbs. I don't know exactly what they're talking about, but probably not for the food sense. But how do you see that distinction there?
Yeah, I think you were seeing this all of a sudden. These open AI large language model platforms coming into the fold. The most known one is the ChatGPT platform, which I was hesitant to kind of mess around with, and I started messing around with it, and I actually became more confident in humanity based on what these AI platforms can do. They're large language models, so what this system can do is it can comb and abstract through the entire internet, all known knowledge that's uploaded to the internet, and it can parse it out and summarize it in very useful ways, but it doesn't think. It can calculate better than humanity, right? But it doesn't think. It doesn't really synthesize, right? It's got an ability to abstract, but not ability to perceive the revealed. It's not feeling what it receives. So in a way, Klaus Schwab is right, but he's right in the worst way, because the godless people that lead our nation in the world, they're going to use these tools, and they're going to say that what this AI is spitting out is the truth when it's not, right? It's their truth, and I think that's going to become kind of more obvious, right? Like you said, there's no pain and suffering. There's no experience of love when it becomes to an AI. And whether you say, eventually the technology and the processing will get so sophisticated that there's going to be a being that is that feels feelings, that seems either impossible, or if it does happen, there's a kind of phase transition that'll happen. So it's this idea of pain and suffering. I was thinking about it today. It's like in Canada and elsewhere, they're actually increasing their euthanasia programs for all ages, and they're advertising it, right? And this idea is to get rid of suffering, and that's what you hear from the moralist, the Sam Harris, who wrote The Moral Landscape, says that we need to get rid of suffering in the world. But that's where the being a human comes in, right? Eliminate pain and suffering to what end? Right? Pain and suffering is a spiritual information. It's something that it communicates to the person about some part of their essence, about their soul, about their spirit, about their relationships, about how they're structuring their lives in a sense. And it's the suffering that causes the repentance, the metanoia, the change that is necessary to grow spiritually. So ultimately, the AI, just like any technology, will be a terrible master but a wonderful slave, in a sense, if you can utilize the God-given technology, right? The logic of computer science and the logic of artificial intelligence is in God's creation. The question is to what end? And I think it's going to be available, maybe not to the level and scale that the military has, the advanced AI and whatnot. It's going to be available to people who have hearts and souls that want to use it for good. So I think the functionality of it, just like any technology, is surprising when it comes into the fold. This is a game-changing technology. This is going to change things dramatically, but that has a double edge to it, like everything else.
Yeah, I think these fools that believe AI is going to be consciousness. I mean, look, there may be something that I think they say the most computing power altogether is barely able to match a cockroach, I mean, so obviously to some degree there might be something interesting, but the idea that it will, be able to have consciousness on level with the human, I think it just shows the plain ignorance of this materialist worldview that undergirds so much of these so-called elites. And I don't know, if they actually believe their own BS, or if they just peddle it to, the masses, thinking that they'll go along with whatever they tell them. Just like, Fauci telling everybody what he said, and he was wrong repeatedly over and over again, but he thought he had a divine right to rule by lies. But, it is interesting, though, that, again, the concept of technology has become synonymous with the world of computers, right? As opposed to, I think a more Christian society would take care of the body, The Christian societies take care of the body and soul. They don't just say, check out into AI, check out into, virtual reality. Christians say, okay, we're going to solve diabetes. We're going to solve depression. We're going to solve, you got pollution problems, we're going to solve it without using coercion or violence or government, corporate welfare or things like that,
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about it like that. What does it mean to solve diabetes, right? And each ailment, any disease, whether it's chronic or even acute fractures or whatnot, they're a manifestation of missing the mark in some way, either in an individual's life or in a collective life, right? So solving the problem is not about fixing the symptom, which is what the technology has allowed us to do masterfully, right? I think it was Stalin that had this quote that said, quantity has a quality all to itself. Right? It's the idea that we can build enough processing power, enough computing power that's going to create some sort of self-reflective consciousness. Doesn't make sense. It's a confusion of terms. Right? Our minds, our spirits are made to calculate. Of course, we have intelligence, we have ability to rationalize, right? But that is a lower level, one level of a higher spiritual tool and connection that we have. We're hyper-focused because we've effaced the idea of the divine and the transcendent. We're hyper-focused on this wonderful quality of the mind to calculate, and to interpolate through this, practical intelligence. But that's part of the process, right? That's half of the process. The ability to have an insight and to draw connections between what's being provided from an intellectual perspective and what it means to one's own life is mediated by the body and the relationships between people and bodies. And I think we need to continue to remember that and stay at that, because I think you're going to see a lot of people have been stripped of their faith in God. They're stripped of their faith in their nation, even in the family, right? It's no better time to unleash something that can give a false sense of meaning, right? You've seen the whole meme of being in your pod, right, with your VR goggles on, having, chemicals pumped into you. Why not? If everything, happiness is just a chemical that's produced by your body, why not cook up some kind of transmitting link that gives you the experience of orgasm or the experience of happiness all the time? And why not use some visual goggles, some virtual reality to actually experience spatially and temporally, at least apparently, these wonderful feelings that your brain is getting? But nobody, it does. Nobody wants to do that, but there's going to be a market for that. I don't know if there's going to be a market for that. Things really open up when we think of the future 5-10 years, when we see the rapidity of what's happening and the changes that are happening today. So it's an open question, but it's like, we were talking earlier, it's a very interesting and fascinating time to be alive. And I'm blessed, and we're blessed to have the experience of being here now. Nobody got to know what happens.
Yeah, I want to talk about that Kissimmee nursery fire. The Fox 35 Orlando says residents concerned about air quality after fire burns hundreds of plastic pots at Kissimmee Nursery. There's a lot of other stories about different food distribution and warehouses revolving around food or the growing of food and raising of animals, having all these types of disasters. And it's hard to know, is this just something that the media, because the public is catching on to a narrative, the media keeps selectively emphasizing things that are maybe happening all the time. But I've seen other stories that say, no, this actually is occurring at a more frequent rate than in last few years than it has before. And then, of course, there's, what is it? And then you get into, is it the breakdown of meritocracy and merit and pursuing excellence? Is it a product of a culture that's not, there was a story I was reading about a particular type of pasta, the star pasta. I can't remember the name right now, but it's shaped like a little tiny star that they were having great sales with it, the pasta manufacturer, but they literally cannot find the manufacturing technology to keep it going. So they're going to have to discontinue it. But it makes you wonder, this kind of decline in industry, decline in knowledge, decline in excellence and hope for the future. Is that what's causing, these things to, factories to not be at the best state or warehouses to not be the most competently taken care of and maintaining safety standards and so forth? Is that what's behind this? And then people on the internet, of course, and so forth, jump to other thoughts like maybe there's somebody trying to sabotage this. And, at this point, people have a right to feel that way, even if that may not be true, because of how much malevolence people have seen in recent years, being so brazen.
Yeah, the ambiguity is kind of the point, David. I think you're right, and I think that what kind of I take from all of these events that are happening is the massive and rapid distrust in the state and in the media, for better or for worse, right? So there is some structure there. It's corrupt, but now for whatever reason, nobody can trust what's coming out, or at least 50% of the population is not going to trust what happened we saw with COVID and then the max coercion vaccination campaign, and we're seeing the consequences of that. We're seeing the incursion into Ukraine and NATO and sending arms there, hundreds of billions of dollars. We're seeing, balloons being shot down, and there's a large contingent of the population that just does not buy the narrative that's coming through. And the same thing is happening with these fires. The fire in Ohio, which is right at the mouth of the Ohio River, where it's, pushing out a bunch of neurotoxins. It's actually a plastic CVC, the fundamental unit of that chemical is being expressed everywhere. And then this fire in Kissimmee is a bunch of plastic as well, right? So it's easy for, people that are, see patterns to observe these patterns like, oh, we're under attack, or some kind of coordinated effort, whether it's, chicken coops and big, large factory chicken farms being, exploded or destroyed, and all the stuff that's coming through our television. It's hard to make sense of, what's the significance of it happening? How much did it happen before? Is it increasing? And what does that mean? You even saw the governor of Ohio talk about that. One of the questions the media asked him is, how did you determine if it was safe? What other areas or domains or people did you consult to determine it's safe for people to come back to their homes? And he said the military. I forgot what department it was, but they consulted with the military, right? It's like, why are you consulting with the military for this kind of feedback when the trust in the communication that's coming from any institution has been damaged really, really bad and almost completely. right? Which is all fine. You shouldn't trust them. They're crooks. But what comes next? What is the outcome if we don't even have a flawed way of making sense of the world together? So I don't know. It seems like the more technology is advancing, the less capacity we have to solve problems. And that's the paradox. In the 80s, growing up in the 80s, we're waiting for flying cars and the DeLorean and, everything kind of being, puppy dogs and ice cream. But it seems we've hit an inversion where the more technology is being advanced, the more smaller number of people are wielding its power and not using it for the greater good, right? And that just might be the way this world is, and not the way the world has always been. With wars. Yeah, I know you were talking earlier in your monologue about the state of war, and it's just my son was asking me, he's like, when was the first war? I was telling him, no, the official first war, and I said, fine, war is the way the world has been. So blackmailing and doing all of these things that we see, that Azov Battalion, that's just the way it might be. So I don't know what the solution is from a political or from a state perspective. But it's not found in these structures that continue to repeat the pattern that has got them there since time immemorial.
Yeah, I mean, when you realize that the folks who seem to have a lot of the oligarchic power because they've deeply captured regulations and printing presses in the West that just print money out of thin air, supporting their industrial power or their profits. A lot of these institutions, you look at the United Nations. I saw this story from the New York Times. This is from July 24th, 1983. Population prizes from the United Nations assailed. This is the United Nations. They rewarded two $12,500 rewards given by United Nations Population Agency to Prime Minister Indira Gandhi of India and to China's family planning chief. Now, this is being denounced in this article by a U.S. economist, saying these countries use brutal methods to curb population growth. So, but you look at it, and it talks about the economist says the harm was done by awarding the prize to a public official in China, where public policy is responsible for the appallingly high rate of female infanticide, where they have that one-child policy. And a prize to the head of state of India, despite her cruel mandated sterilization. During the emergency rule she imposed on India from 1975 to 1977, Mrs. Gandhi's government was accused of forcing men in villages to undergo sterilization. China's family planning minister received the other award, uses a system of punishment for couples who have two or more children. And women carrying a second child who refuse an abortion can lose 20% of their pay. Why are we, United Nations and Klaus Schwab, that's their same they didn't lose their ideology in any ways. They got worse in some cases. So people have a right to be suspicious when they see chicken coops going up in flames and, nurseries going up in flames when we're being told to eat bugs and synthetic food. We have a right to, because these people have a long track record of giving deep rewards to people who literally sterilize through force and create forced abortions,
Yeah, it's an attractive thing to think, right? That it's kind of like the Achilles heel of liberalism in the West, of being so, turning everything and said human beings are the problem and population explosion is the problem. I've heard only until recently, the last 10 years, it was the completely accepted notion that the population is getting too big. And if it continues to get too big, we'll have resource depletion and we're not going to be able to feed people. But we've seen the opposite be the case. We've seen the population explode in the last 50 years. And we've seen a lot of the predictions that came in the 50s and 60s from the Green Movement actually inverse. There was a kind of green revolution in the 60s and the 60s and 70s that led to us coming, out of poverty at a rapid pace after the year 2000. I mean, poverty is diminishing, right? So it's like, I don't know if it's the momentum of this idea of population is too high, but people like Elon Musk and other people are saying no, population is too small. That would increase the population. I guess the question ultimately comes in when we talk about population. Like again, Stalin said that one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a data point. right? When we talk about populations, it's easy to think of people as fungible tokens, right? But when we're talking about persons and people, that makes things like abortion and population control be abhorrent, like it is if you have a heart and if you have you don't have to be Christian to see the dignity of a human being, of a child, of a baby. You don't have to be a Christian, to see what it's a fundamental, reality that we are troubling with, and we're facing a lot of trouble because that's happening, right? Because that is ultimately a sin. The biggest sin is not to see your neighbor, your fellow human being, as a worthy individual person. Once that goes, downstream, we get to see all of the lunacy that we're seeing, especially through social media, what amplifies it all.
Right. Yeah. And there's you have popular figures like, comedians and movie stars and everybody telling us don't have families, shaming people for wanting to have a bright future. We have to turn the page on this nihilism. We have to. And I don't know exactly what all the answers are to how to get that done, but we all have to come to a conclusion that we're not going to have a pro-death, anti-child culture. And I think that's a starting point to getting past this state, this era of paranoia and despair that is kind of filling into a lot of people's hearts right now.
Yeah, the problem is that the people that are, let's say, pro-abortion, right, they're not seeing it as, the death of a child or the dignity of a person. They might really believe that, but somehow something has taken over them. I don't know if it's the ideological, political capture that you can put away your actual care for human beings, which is inculcated in your person if you're alive right now, and put that to a side and before something like, mass abortions at this scale that we're in. If you really drill down to that, people will agree, abortion should be used as wholesale birth control, except even the extreme would think that. But it's a change in the way we can think about the issue that I think is the problem, and the inability to have the conversation about really what is valuable in life. What are we here to do? What's important? I think when you drill down with almost anybody, that will come to kind of the same conclusions. Right, but then the critic will pop up. Look how terrible families are. Look at divorce. Look at terrible fathers beating their wives and beating their kids. Yeah, these are all terrible things, right? But the notion of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, throwing out families as such, because there's been a loss in trust in families as well. That's problematic. What are you going to replace it with? Communes? What do you think communes going to structure on, based on the dynamics of familiar relationships? So it's a really confusing and a confused time. But it was written that this would happen.
Very good. James, always great to have you on, and check out the Roosters Crow podcast on YouTube. Any last thoughts?